The snow fell thick and silent that night, blanketing the small town in white. Inside a tiny wooden house on the edge of the road, an old lady heard a knock at her door. Faint at first, then frantic. When she opened it, a man stood there shivering, his clothes torn, his eyes hollow. "Please, ma'am, I just need a place to warm up." She hesitated only a second before stepping aside. She gave him soup, a blanket, and a quiet smile, the kind that said she still believed in kindness, even in a world that had forgotten it. He said little that night, just sat by the fire, staring at the flames as if they could burn away his past. But when dawn broke, she awoke to the sound of engines, dozens of them. 50 police cars lined up outside her home, and what they were looking for was sitting right there in her living room. Stay with me until the end, because what happened next will test everything you believe about guilt, forgiveness, and second chances. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Margaret Chen had lived in the same weathered house for 43 years. At 71, her world had grown small, contained within these four walls and the memories they held. Her husband Thomas had built this place with his own hands back in 1981, every nail hammered with the promise forever had end of forever. But 6 years ago, when cancer took him, leaving Margaret alone with her cats, her garden, and a faith in humanity that most people her age had long since abandoned, the house sat at the very edge of Millbrook, a town so small that everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew it themselves. Margaret's nearest neighbor lived a quarter-mile down the road, close enough to wave from the porch, but far enough away that her evening routines went unnoticed. She liked it that way. The solitude gave her space to think, to remember, to live quietly with her choices. That particular February night, the Weather Service had issued warnings that most folks took seriously. A nor'easter was bearing down on their little corner of Vermont, promising to dump 2 feet of snow and winds that would make travel impossible. Margaret had stocked up on essentials earlier in the week. Her old Honda Civic loaded down with canned goods, batteries, and enough cat food to last through whatever winter could throw at them. She'd settled in for the evening with her usual routine. Dinner at 6, the local news at 7, and then an hour with her knitting while the wind picked up outside. The cats, Whiskers, and Mittens had claimed their spots by the wood-burning stove, their purring a gentle soundtrack to the growing storm. Margaret had learned to find peace in these simple rhythms, even if they sometimes felt hollow without Thomas there to share them. The knock came at 8:47. She remembered the exact time because she'd just glanced at the mantel clock, wondering if the storm would knock out their power like it had 3 winters before. At first, she thought it might be the wind rattling something loose, but then it came again, more insistent. Margaret's heart quickened. In 43 years, no one had ever knocked on her door this late, especially not in weather like this. She moved cautiously toward the front window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out into the swirling white. A figure stood on her porch, hunched against the cold, shoulders shaking. "Who's there?" she called through the door, her voice steady despite the nervousness crawling up her spine. "Ma'am, please. I'm sorry to bother you so late. I just need somewhere to get warm." The voice was deep, tired, carrying the weight of desperation. Margaret pressed her face closer to the window, trying to make out details through the storm. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a thin jacket completely inadequate for the brutal cold. His hands were pressed together, breath visible in white puffs even under the shelter of her porch. Every instinct told her to keep the door locked. She was a small, elderly woman living alone, and this was exactly the kind of situation Thomas had always worried about. But something in the man's voice stopped her from walking away. It wasn't threatening or demanding. It was the sound of someone who'd reached the end of their rope and was asking for the most basic human kindness. Margaret's hand hovered over the deadbolt. She thought about Thomas, about the countless times he'd helped stranded travelers when their car broke down on the rural highway that ran past their property. He'd never turned anyone away, even when Margaret worried about the risks. "We've got to trust that most people are good," he used to say. "The moment we stop believing, that is the moment we stop being good ourselves." The lock clicked open. The man who stepped into her entryway was younger than his voice had suggested, maybe 45, with close-cropped graying hair and skin weathered by years of hard living. His clothes were indeed thin, a denim jacket over a cotton shirt that offered no protection against February's bite. But it was his eyes that caught Margaret's attention. They held a depth of exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness, the look of someone who'd been carrying burdens too heavy for any one person to bear. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice rough with cold and something else Margaret couldn't quite identify. "I know this is unusual. I wouldn't have bothered you if I had anywhere else to go." Margaret studied his face for a moment longer, then stepped aside to let him fully enter. "You'll freeze to death out there. Come sit by the fire." She led him into the living room, where the wood stove radiated blessed warmth. He moved carefully, as if afraid his presence might contaminate something precious, and settled into the chair she indicated, with obvious relief. Up close, Margaret could see that his hands were raw from the cold. His lips tinged blue despite the shelter. "I'll get you something hot to drink," she said, already moving toward the kitchen. "And there's soup left from dinner. I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing. You're accepting help when you need it. There's a difference." As Margaret heated the leftover vegetable soup on her gas stove, she found herself stealing glances at her unexpected guest. He sat perfectly still, staring into the fire with an intensity that suggested he was seeing more than just flames. His posture was rigid, controlled, as if relaxing completely might be dangerous somehow. She returned with a bowl of soup and a mug of coffee, setting them on the small table beside his chair. "It's not much, but it'll warm you up." The man looked up at her with an expression of profound gratitude that made Margaret's chest tighten. "You have no idea what this means to me." As he ate, Margaret busied herself with small tasks, giving him space while keeping an eye on him from the kitchen. She pulled an extra blanket from the hall closet, set it on the couch where he could reach it. The cats had emerged from their hiding spots and were watching the stranger with typical feline curiosity, though they kept their distance. "I'm Margaret," she said finally, settling into her own chair with a cup of tea. "Marcus," he replied, then seemed to hesitate. "Marcus Washington." The name meant nothing to her, but she noticed how he said it, as if he expected some kind of reaction. When none came, his shoulders relaxed slightly. "Bad night to be traveling," Margaret observed, sipping her tea. Marcus nodded, his hands wrapped around the coffee mug as if it were a lifeline. "I was trying to make it to Burlington. Bus broke down about 10 miles back, and I've been walking ever since. When the storm got worse, I saw your light. Walking 10 miles in this weather? You could have died out there." "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I had to keep moving." There was something in his tone that made Margaret look at him more closely. The way he kept glancing toward the windows, the tension that never quite left his shoulders, the careful way he chose his words. This wasn't just a stranded traveler. This was a man running from something. But that night, as the storm raged outside and Marcus sat by her fire slowly warming back to life, Margaret chose not she to ask the questions that were building in her mind. Sometimes learned, the most important thing you could offer someone was the gift of not having to explain themselves. Not yet. They sat in comfortable silence for the next hour, the only sounds coming from the crackling fire and the relentless wind outside. Margaret found herself studying Marcus when she thought he wasn't looking. There were details she hadn't noticed at first. A small scar above his left eyebrow, calluses on his hands that spoke of manual labor, the way he held himself, straight-backed even in exhaustion, as if military training had become muscle memory. Most telling was how he ate, slowly, deliberately, savoring every spoonful as if he couldn't quite believe the food was real. Margaret had seen that kind of careful appreciation before, years ago when she volunteered at the shelter in Burlington. It was the way people ate when they'd gone hungry, when a warm meal wasn't something you could take for granted. "More soup?" she asked when his bowl was empty. Marcus shook his head. "You've done enough already. There's plenty left. I'm fine, really." He set the bowl aside and leaned back in the chair, some of the tension finally leaving his frame. "I haven't felt warm like this in months." The admission slipped out before he could stop it, and Margaret saw him tense again immediately. Months. That single word painted a picture she wasn't sure she was ready to see. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, the wind had grown stronger, howling around the corners of the house with a ferocity that made the windows rattle in their frames. Margaret glanced at the old barometer on the mantel. The pressure was still dropping. "Looks like you'll be here until morning at least," she said. The roads won, the plows get through. Something it be passable until flickered across Marcus's face. "I done fear, maybe. Or resignation want to be a burden. The only burden would be sending you back out there to freeze." Margaret stood and moved to the linen closet. The couch pulls out into a bed. It's not fancy, but it's warm and dry. As she pulled sheets and pillows from the closet, Margaret felt the weight of her decision settling around her. She was harboring a stranger, a man who clearly had secrets he wasn't ready to share. Thomas would have done the same thing. She knew that. But Thomas had been 6'2" and broad as an oak tree. Margaret was 5' nothing and weighed about as much as a strong wind could carry away. Still, when she looked at Marcus, she didn't see danger. She saw exhaustion. She saw gratitude. She saw someone who'd been pushed to the very edge of what a person could endure and was still trying to maintain some shred of dignity. "The bathroom's down the hall," she said, setting the bedding on the couch. "There are clean towels in the cabinet if you want to wash up." "Thank you." Marcus stood slowly, as if his joints ached. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to know something." Margaret paused, her hands still smoothing the sheets. "What's that?" "I'm not a bad person. I've made mistakes, big ones, but I'm not someone you need to be afraid of." The earnestness in his voice made her look up. "I never said you were. You didn't have to. You took a risk letting me in, and I want you to know it was the right choice." Margaret studied his face for a long moment. Whatever Marcus Washington was running from, whatever had put that haunted look in his eyes, she believed him. Call it intuition, call it foolishness. But she believed that beneath the secrets and the careful words, he was telling the truth about the person he was at his core. "Get some rest," she said simply. "Tomorrow's problems can wait until tomorrow." After Marcus disappeared down the hall, Margaret sat in her chair and listened to the storm. The cats had warmed up to their guest enough to venture closer, though they still maintained a respectful distance. Whiskers, the bolder of the two, had claimed a spot on the arm of the co-stranger. Margaret, one eye on Thuke, where he could keep, found herself thinking about the choices that had led to this moment. The choice to answer the door, the choice to let him in, the choice to offer food and shelter without demanding explanations. Each decision had felt natural at the time, guided by instincts she'd learned to trust over 7 decades of living. But now, in the quiet moments before sleep, she wondered what morning would bring. She heard the shower running, then stop, heard footsteps moving carefully back to the living room. When she checked on Marcus one last time before heading to her own room, she found him sitting on the edge of the makeshift bed, staring out the window at the swirling snow. "Penny for your thoughts," she said from the doorway. He turned, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, just thinking about how different things might have been if I'd made better choices along the way. We all have those thoughts. The trick is not letting them paralyze you. How do you do it? How do you keep moving forward when you've hurt people you care about? The question hung in the air between them. Heavy with implications Margaret wasn't sure she was ready to unpack. But she saw something in Marcus's face that reminded her of herself in those dark months after Thomas's diagnosis, when every day felt like a battle between hope and despair. "You focus on what you can control," she said finally. "You can't change the past, but you can choose what kind of person you want to be going forward. And you remember that forgiveness, especially forgiving yourself, is a process, not a destination. Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Your husband was lucky to have you. I was the lucky one. Margaret pulled her robe tighter around her shoulders. Try to get some sleep. The storm should pass by morning. As she made her way to her bedroom, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something significant. Not just the storm outside, but something larger, more consequential. The kind of moment that divided your life into before and after. She knelt beside her bed for her nightly prayers, as she had every night since she was 5 years old. But tonight she added something new. A prayer for the stranger sleeping on her couch. A prayer for whatever demons he was wrestling with. And a prayer for the wisdom to handle whatever tomorrow might bring. Outside, the wind continued to howl, piling snow against the windows and burying the small house deeper in winter's embrace. Inside, two unlikely companions slept, each carrying their own burdens, each finding temporary refuge from the storms that had brought them together. Neither of them knew that by sunrise, everything would change. The first sound that woke Margaret wasn't the wind, which had finally died down to a whisper, but something else entirely. A low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once, growing steadily louder until it penetrated her dreams and pulled her back to consciousness. She lay still for a moment, trying to identify the noise. It sounded almost like thunder, but wrong somehow. Too sustained, too rhythmic. As consciousness fully returned, she recognized it for what it was. Engines. Lots of them. Margaret slipped out of bed and moved to her bedroom window, pulling back the curtain with trembling fingers. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Police cars. Dozens of them, stretching down her long driveway and spilling out onto the main road. Their red and blue lights cut through the early morning darkness like angry stars, painting the fresh snow in alternating colors of urgency and authority. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she counted them. 20, 30, 40 cars at least, with more arriving every moment. Officers were positioning themselves around her property with military precision, some taking cover behind their vehicles, others moving through the trees that bordered her land. This wasn't a routine check. This was a siege. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled on her robe and slippers. The rumble of engines had grown into a constant roar that seemed to make the entire house vibrate. Through her bedroom window, she could see officers moving with practiced efficiency, their weapons drawn, their faces grim behind tactical gear. She crept down the hallway, her heart pounding so hard, she was sure the sound would wake Marcus. But when she reached the living room, she found him already awake, sitting on the edge of the pull-out bed with his head in his hands. He looked up when she entered, and she saw something in his expression that made her stomach drop. He'd been expecting this. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the commotion outside. "What's happening? Who are they looking for?" He stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. Outside, she could hear voices shouting orders, the crackle of radio static, the slam of car doors. The lights from their vehicles painted shifting patterns across her living room walls, turning her cozy sanctuary into something that felt alien and threatening. "They're looking for me," Marcus said quietly. His voice was steady, but she could see the resignation in his shoulders. The way his hands hung loose at his sides like a man who'd stopped fighting a battle he knew he couldn't win. Margaret felt the floor shift beneath her feet. The warm, grateful stranger who'd sat by her fire just hours ago suddenly seemed like someone she'd never met. "What did you do?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the red and blue lights dancing across the ceiling. When he finally spoke, his words came out measured, careful, as if he'd rehearsed them countless times in his head. 3 years ago, I was convicted of armed robbery. Bank job in Burlington. I served my time, got out 8 months ago on good behavior. He looked at her then, his eyes steady despite everything. But yesterday, another bank got hit. Same pattern, same style. They think it was me. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Margaret sank into her chair, her mind reeling. Armed robbery. Banks. The man she'd fed soup to, the man she'd tucked under her grandmother's quilt, was a convicted felon being hunted by what looked like half the state police force. Was it? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Did you do it? Marcus met her eyes without flinching. No. I was in Burlington yesterday trying to find work, but I don't have an alibi they'll believe. I was walking around, asking at different shops, talking to people who probably won't remember me. When I heard about the robbery on the radio this morning, I knew they'd come for me first. Outside, the voices were getting closer. Margaret could make out individual words now. Commands being shouted, coordinates being relayed. Someone was talking about securing the perimeter, about establishing a safe distance for the negotiator. That's why you were walking in the storm, Margaret said, pieces clicking into place. You weren't trying to get to Burlington. You were running. I panicked, Marcus admitted. I know how this looks. Ex-con, fresh out of prison. Same crime happens in the same area. They're not going to listen to explanations. They're going to see what they expect to see. A voice boomed from outside, amplified by a megaphone. Marcus Washington, this is Detective Riley with the Vermont State Police. We know you're in there. We need you to come out with your hands visible. No one needs to get hurt here. Margaret's blood ran cold. They weren't just looking for him. They knew exactly where he was. Someone must have seen him come to her house, or maybe they'd been tracking him longer than he realized. Marcus stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. I need to go out there. If I stay, they might think you're involved. You could get hurt. Wait. Margaret grabbed his arm, surprised by her own boldness. Just wait a minute. Let me think. The megaphone crackled to life again. Marcus, we're not going anywhere. Make this easy on yourself and come out now. We have the house surrounded. Margaret's mind raced. She thought about the man who'd sat in her living room, who'd eaten her soup with the careful appreciation of someone who'd gone hungry. She thought about the way he'd thanked her, the genuine gratitude in his eyes. She thought about his question from the night before. Do you keep moving forward when you've hurt people you care about? Do how you have a lawyer? She asked. Marcus looked at her like she'd suggested he sprout wings and fly away. Mrs. Chen, I appreciate everything you've done, but this isn't your problem. Maybe not, but I'm making it my problem. Margaret stood up, straightening her shoulders in a way that would have made Thomas proud. You said you didn't do it. I believe you. Why? The question came out raw, vulnerable. You barely know me. Margaret thought about that for a moment. It was true. She'd known Marcus Washington for less than 12 hours. She knew almost nothing about his life, his history, his struggles, but she'd seen something in him that went deeper than facts and circumstances. Because I watched you eat my soup, like it was the first good thing that had happened to you in months. Because you asked permission before you sat down. Because you made sure to thank me even though you were half frozen and exhausted. She paused, looking at this man who'd stumbled into her quiet life like a stone thrown into still water. Because when you told me you weren't a bad person, I believed you. The megaphone crackled again. Marcus, we're going to count to 30, and then we're coming in. 1. Marcus closed his eyes, and Margaret saw his jaw clench. I can't let them think you were hiding me. I can't let you get in trouble because you showed kindness to a stranger. 2. Margaret walked to her front window and looked out at the army of police cars surrounding her home. Officers crouched behind open doors, their weapons trained on her house. Spotlights blazed from multiple angles, turning her snow-covered yard into something that looked like a movie set. 3. She'd lived in this house for 43 years. She'd raised her children here, buried her husband from the funeral home just down the road, survived losses and celebrated joys within these walls. This was her sanctuary, her refuge from a world that often seemed too harsh and too quick to judge. 4. And now that world had come to her door, demanding answers, demanding justice, demanding that she choose sides in a conflict she barely understood. 5. But as Margaret looked out at those flashing lights, she realized something that surprised her. She wasn't afraid. Not of the police, not of the consequences, not of what people would say. She was angry. 6. Angry at a system that would hunt a man through a blizzard without giving him a chance to prove his innocence. Angry at a world that saw only labels and categories instead of human beings. Angry at the assumption that kindness was something to be suspicious of rather than celebrated. 7. Margaret Chen had spent 7 decades learning how to be invisible, how to keep her head down and avoid making waves. But standing in her living room, watching Marcus prepare to surrender himself to a fate he might not deserve, she discovered something she didn't know she still possessed. 8. Courage. Margaret walked to her front door and placed her hand on the deadbolt. Behind her, Marcus stood frozen, watching her with an expression of disbelief mixed with something that might have been hope. 9. She turned the lock and opened the door. The cold morning air hit her like a slap, carrying with it the smell of exhaust and the metallic taste of adrenaline. Spotlights immediately swiveled toward her, turning her small figure into a silhouette against the bright white snow. 10. "Don't shoot," Margaret called out, her voice carrying farther than she'd expected in the crisp air. "I'm coming out to talk." She stepped onto her porch, her slippers crunching in the snow that had drifted across the boards during the night. The lights were so bright she could barely make out the shapes of the officers behind them, but she could feel their attention focused on her like heat from a fire. "Ma'am, step away from the house," a voice called through the megaphone. "We need you to move to safety. This is my house," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "And I'm not moving until we talk." A figure emerged from behind one of the police cars, hands raised to show he was unarmed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a thick jacket with police emblazoned across the chest. As he got closer, Margaret could see he was older than she'd expected, maybe 55, with gray hair and kind eyes that seemed at odds with the tactical gear surrounding them. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Detective Riley. Are you hurt? Has he threatened you in any way?" Margaret almost laughed at the question. "Threatened me?" "He thanked me for the soup." The detective stopped about 10 feet from her porch, close enough to talk without shouting, but far enough away to maintain what was probably protocol. "Ma'am, I understand this might be confusing, but Marcus Washington is wanted in connection with a serious crime. We need him to come out so we can sort this all out safely." "And then what happens?" Detective Riley's expression softened slightly. "Then we take him in for questioning. If he's innocent like you seem to think, the process will determine that." "The process?" Margaret repeated the words like they tasted bitter. "Detective Riley, can I ask you something?" He nodded, though she could see him glancing past her toward the house, probably wondering where Marcus was. "How many times has your process been wrong?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Ma'am, how many innocent people has your process put in prison? How many guilty people has it set free? How many lives has it destroyed while it was busy determining things?" Detective Riley was quiet for a moment, and Margaret could see something shift in his expression. "More than I'd like to admit," he said finally. "Then maybe," Margaret said, pulling her robe tighter around her shoulders, "we should try something different this time." Behind her, she heard the soft sound of footsteps on hardwood floors. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his hands clearly visible, his movements slow and non-threatening, but he didn't step outside. Instead, he stood just behind Margaret, close enough to surrender if things went wrong, but far enough back to make it clear he wasn't using her as a shield. "Detective Riley?" Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the snowy yard. "I'm not armed. I'm not dangerous. And I didn't rob that bank yesterday." The detective's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, then stopped. "Then why did you run, Marcus?" "Because I knew you wouldn't believe me. Because I'm an ex-con, and that's all you'd see. Because the last time I trusted the system to get things right, I lost 3 years of my life." Margaret felt Marcus's words hit her like physical blows. 3 years. 3 years of a life interrupted, of dreams deferred, of a man learning to survive in a place that stripped away everything except the will to keep breathing. "But I'm tired of running," Marcus continued, "and I won't let Mrs. Chen get in trouble for showing kindness to someone who needed it." Detective Riley looked between them, and Margaret could see him processing the scene before him. An elderly woman in her nightgown and slippers, standing on her front porch in the snow. A wanted man who could have used her as a hostage, but instead was protecting her from consequences she'd chosen for herself. "Mrs. Chen," the detective said slowly, "how long has Mr. Washington been here?" "Since about 9 o'clock last night. He knocked on my door asking for shelter from the storm. And in that time, did he say or do anything that made you feel unsafe?" Margaret thought about the question seriously, remembering the hours they'd spent together. Marcus sitting by her fire, eating her soup, asking thoughtful questions about forgiveness and moving forward. The careful way he'd moved through her house, the genuine gratitude in his voice, the way he'd worried about being a burden. "No," she said firmly. "Quite the opposite, actually." Margaret Chen stood on her porch that morning and did something remarkable. She chose to see a human being instead of a label. She chose compassion over fear. She chose to believe that sometimes, just sometimes, the system gets it wrong and people deserve second chances. The investigation that followed revealed Marcus was telling the truth. Security footage from 3 different locations placed him miles away from the bank robbery. The real perpetrator was caught 2 weeks later. But what mattered most wasn't whether Marcus was guilty or innocent. What mattered was that in a world quick to judge and slow to forgive, one elderly woman decided that kindness was worth the risk. Sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is opening your door to someone the world has written off. Margaret reminded us that behind every label, every conviction, every mistake, there's still a person worthy of dignity. In a society that profits from division and fear, choosing to see humanity in everyone becomes a revolutionary act. What would you have done? Would you have opened that door,